My name is Margaret Ellis. I'm 72 years old. On the morning of October 14, 2024, at exactly 9:18 a.m., my son handed a clipboard to a woman wearing navy blue scrubs and smiled as if he were checking me into a nice hotel. "You'll be happier here, Mom," he said. "Let's stop pretending you can take care of yourself." The administrator, Linda Harper, 58, adjusted her glasses and asked me to sign the last page. Before I could answer, my son leaned closer. "This is for your own good," he whispered. "Besides, this place belongs to professionals now. Your old life is over." He thought those words hurt me. They didn't. Not anymore. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't beg him to reconsider. I simply uncapped my fountain pen, signed my name exactly where Linda pointed, folded my hands in my lap, and looked out the window at the maple tree whose leaves had already turned red. Because what my son didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that the building he had just signed me into still belonged to me. The deed had never left my name. Not once. He believed he was delivering me into someone else's care. In reality, he had just walked into my house. And by the end of that same afternoon, every person who had helped him would discover exactly who they had tried to lock away. Before I tell you how I took back everything they thought they had stolen, and I mean everything, do me one favor. Subscribe right now, because what happened after that day was even stranger than what happened inside those walls, and I'll tell you that story next. And tell me your city and your local time in the comments. I read everyone because I like knowing where people are when they hear stories like mine. People love saying betrayal starts with one bad decision. It doesn't. It starts with thousands of tiny ones that nobody notices until they become normal. I grew up in Traverse City, Michigan, in a little white farmhouse on Cherry Bend Road where every cabinet door squeaked and every Sunday smelled like cinnamon bread. My father, Richard Ellis, believed sons carried family names. Daughters carried responsibilities. I learned that before I learned long division. My younger brother, Daniel, got a brand new bicycle for his 10th birthday. I received my mother's old sewing machine. "One of you will build a future," my father said while patting Daniel's shoulder. "The other will keep the house standing." He wasn't joking. Nobody laughed. My grandmother did, though. Not because she agreed. Because she knew he was wrong. Eleanor Brooks, 71 when I was a teenager, had silver hair she refused to dye and a habit of carrying peppermint candies in every coat pocket she owned. She owned several apartment buildings around northern Michigan. Most people never knew. She dressed too simply. Drove the same old Buick for 18 years. And never corrected anyone who assumed she had nothing. One rainy afternoon in May of 1968, I sat beside her on the front porch after my father canceled my college visit. "We can't waste tuition on someone who's just going to marry," he said. I remember staring at the wet gravel driveway. Grandma handed me a peppermint. "Listen carefully," she said. "The loudest people usually own the least." I frowned. She smiled. "The quiet ones keep the paperwork." At 16, I thought she was talking about taxes. Years later, I realized she was teaching me how power actually worked. She never argued with my father. Never tried to embarrass him. She simply bought another property every few years while everyone else underestimated her. When I graduated high school in 1970, she gave me a plain brown envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $21,840. I almost dropped it. "I can't take this." "Yes," she said. "You can." "What if Dad finds out?" "He won't." She looked directly at me. Never confuse ownership with attention. That sentence stayed with me longer than anything my parents ever said. I attended community college. Worked mornings at a diner. Studied accounting at night. By 26, I had saved enough for the down payment on my first duplex. Nothing glamorous. Peeling paint. Leaky roof. Broken furnace. Everyone told me I was making a mistake. Grandma just asked one question. Does it make money while you sleep? When I nodded, she smiled the same quiet smile she'd worn my entire life. Years passed. I married Thomas Ellis, a high school history teacher who loved old jazz records and refused to buy disposable tools. If it breaks after one use, he'd say, it wasn't worth owning. We weren't rich. Not at first. But we were disciplined. Every bonus. Every tax refund. Every overtime check went into another property. By 1999, we owned 6 small buildings. Nothing extravagant. Just dependable. Steady rent. Steady repairs. Steady income. Then came the opportunity nobody wanted. An aging assisted living facility called Maple Grove Residence on West Front Street. The roof leaked. Half the rooms were empty. Inspectors had cited it 3 times. Our accountant thought we were crazy. This place is a money pit. Thomas looked at me across the kitchen table. What do you think? I answered without hesitation. I think old people deserve better. So we bought it for $486,000. Everyone said we'd lose everything. Instead, we spent 4 years rebuilding it. New elevators. New kitchens. Better nurses. Private gardens. A therapy room. A library filled with books residents actually requested. When the renovation ended, the waiting list stretched almost 8 months. Grandma visited only once. She walked through the lobby slowly. Ran her hand across the polished oak reception desk. Then leaned toward me. See? I smiled. See what? You kept the paperwork. She passed away the following winter. Peacefully. 92 years old. At her funeral, people praised her kindness. Her patience. Her wisdom. Almost nobody mentioned her business sense. She would have preferred it that way. After Thomas died from a heart attack in 2018, I buried myself in work. Not because I needed the money. Because empty houses echo. Busy days don't. My son, Evan, visited less often every year. There was always another meeting. Another business trip. Another excuse. When he did come over, he noticed things I'd never taught him to notice. Property values. Insurance papers. Bank folders. Tax files. Never the photo albums. Never the piano his father loved. Never the flowers blooming beside the porch. Just numbers. One afternoon, he looked around my office. You know, Mom, he said, selling all this would make life easier. I smiled politely. I didn't spend 50 years building it because it was easy. He laughed. You don't need all this anymore. I remember those exact words because they sounded strangely familiar. Like my father's voice had borrowed my son's mouth. If you've ever been the one who worked quietly while someone else acted like they deserved the reward, type foundation in the comments. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones nobody notices until everything starts falling apart. And if this part of my story feels familiar, hit like, not for me, but for yourself. Because building a life brick by brick is something nobody should ever make you apologize for. That conversation stayed with me longer than I admitted. Because a week later, for the first time in my life, my son asked me for complete access to every one of my business records. My first instinct was to laugh. Not because the request was funny. Because it was so unlike the boy I had raised. Evan had never once asked how I negotiated leases, why I refinanced certain buildings, or how I chose property managers. Yet on November 3, 2023, at 6:41 p.m., he stood in my kitchen, coffee untouched, staring at a stack of binders. I should understand the business, he said. In case something happens. Something. Such a small word. It can hide an awful lot. I closed the top binder and slid it toward myself. When something happens, I said, my attorney knows exactly what to do. He forced a smile. I just want to help. I know. But I also knew something else. People who truly want to help usually begin by asking what you need. They don't begin by asking where you keep the deeds. Over the next few months, little things changed. He started calling every Tuesday. Not to ask how I was feeling. To ask whether I had met with my accountant. He offered to organize my office. He volunteered to drive me to appointments I had never mentioned. Each offer sounded generous. Each one arrived a little too perfectly timed. Then came January 16, 2024. My attorney, Michael Porter, 64, called just before lunch. Margaret, he said, did you authorize anyone to request copies of your ownership records? I looked out at the snow covering the garden. No. There was a long pause. Someone claiming to represent you requested certified copies of several commercial properties. My grip tightened around the phone. Who? Evan Ellis. Silence settled between us. Michael finally spoke again. I refused. Thank you. I thought you'd want to know. I do. When I hung up, I didn't confront my son. Grandma had taught me that long ago. Never interrupt someone who's revealing themselves. Let them finish. The truth usually arrives without being chased. So I watched. Quietly. By early spring, Evan began bringing his wife, Natalie, to Sunday dinners again. She was pleasant. Always had been. An elementary school librarian with a habit of apologizing for things that weren't her fault. But lately, she barely spoke whenever business came up. Instead, Evan filled every silence. You've worked hard enough. You deserve to relax. Retirement looks good on you. Each sentence sounded kind. Each one carried the same destination. Stop managing. Step aside. Hand everything over. Then one evening, after they left, Natalie texted me. Not a paragraph. Not an explanation. Just 7 words. Please don't sign anything without Michael present. Nothing else. No emoji. No follow-up. I stared at the message for almost an hour. The next morning it disappeared. Unsent. Or deleted. It didn't matter. I'd already taken a screenshot. 3 weeks later, I met Michael at his office on April 11, 2024, at 10:47 a.m. He closed the conference room door. I've been looking into something. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of emails. Corporate filings. Meeting notes. One name appeared over and over. Victor Langford. Age 55. Commercial real estate developer. Known for buying healthcare facilities, renovating them just enough to flip them to investment groups. Michael tapped one page. Evan has met with him 9 times. 9? He nodded. Over 6 months. What does Victor want? Michael looked directly at me. Maple Grove. The room became very quiet. Not because I was shocked. Because the puzzle pieces finally fit together. Victor didn't want my apartment buildings. He didn't care about the duplexes. He wanted the nursing home. Occupancy sat at 98%. Revenue was stable. Its land alone had nearly doubled in value. Michael turned another page. This draft proposal values the property at $8,640,000. I looked at the figure. Then at him. They're planning to buy it? They're planning to convince you to sell. And if I refuse? He answered without hesitation. They'll try to convince a court you're incapable of managing your affairs. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Outside, someone laughed in the hallway. Life continued as if nothing had changed. Michael leaned forward. I have another question. I nodded. Where's the original deed? I smiled for the first time all morning. Exactly where Grandma told me it should be. He smiled back. Good. Because the county records show something very interesting. He pointed to a highlighted paragraph. Years earlier, when Thomas and I refinanced Maple Grove, every supporting document had been updated. Except one. The ownership clause. The facility remained solely in my name. Not the family trust. Not a holding company. Not joint ownership. Mine. Only mine. Michael folded his hands. Even if someone gained temporary authority over your personal finances, they still couldn't sell the building. Correct. Unless. He stopped himself. Unless. They convinced everyone, including the facility's management, that they were already in control. I drove home thinking about that sentence. Control isn't always legal. Sometimes it's theatrical. People believe the person carrying the clipboard. The person speaking confidently. The person wearing the expensive suit. They rarely ask to see the paperwork. Grandma had been right again. The quiet ones keep it. Everything I'm about to tell you next happened in exactly 12 minutes. 12 minutes that unraveled months of planning and decades of assumptions. If you're not subscribed yet, now's the time, because what happened after that confrontation became an even bigger story, and I'll tell it to the people who stay with me. And tell me this in the comments: if you were standing where I was, would you have walked away, or would you have stood your ground? I read every single answer. 3 days later, on April 15, 2024, Evan called. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. Mom, I found a beautiful assisted living community. I already knew which one. I simply let him keep talking. Because sometimes, the loudest people tell you exactly how they're going to lose. On October 14, 2024, at exactly 9:18 a.m., I let my son believe every word he was saying. He drove me to Maple Grove himself. He even carried my overnight bag. I picked the nicest room, Evan said as we walked through the lobby. You'll have nurses around the clock. You'll finally be safe. Safe. It was an interesting choice of word. Because I had spent 23 years making sure everyone else inside that building was safe. The receptionist smiled politely. So good to see you again, Mrs. Ellis. Before she could say anything else, Evan interrupted. We've already completed the paperwork. His confidence filled the room. People naturally stepped aside. That was always his gift. Looking important. Not being important. Linda Harper, the administrator, appeared carrying the admission folder. She looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Mrs. Ellis, she said softly, if you'll just sign here. Evan answered for me. She understands. I quietly signed my name. Exactly where the line pointed. Then I folded the pen and slipped it back into my purse. Evan smiled. I'll visit every weekend. I nodded. I'm sure you will. He started walking toward the exit. Then Linda cleared her throat. Mr. Ellis. He stopped. There's one more signature we need. He sighed dramatically. I've already signed everything. This one's different. She handed him another document. He barely looked at it. What is this? Before Linda could answer, another voice spoke from the hallway. It's a verification form. Everyone turned. Michael Porter walked into the lobby carrying a leather briefcase. Beside him was County Clerk Susan Ramirez, age 53. Behind them stood Deputy Daryl Hawthorne, 42, licensed in 3 counties. And finally, Victor Langford. Only he wasn't smiling anymore. Evan frowned. What is this? Michael set a thick folder on the reception desk. It's called due diligence. Victor looked confused. This wasn't part of our meeting. Michael calmly opened the folder. No. It wasn't. He slid the original deed across the polished oak counter. Linda looked down. Her eyes widened. Susan Ramirez adjusted her glasses. I verified this personally at 8:12 this morning. She tapped the seal. The owner of Maple Grove Residence is Margaret Ellis. She looked directly at Evan. Only Margaret Ellis. Silence. Heavy. Absolute. Victor grabbed the document. This has to be outdated. Susan shook her head. It isn't. He flipped through more pages. No, there should be transfer paperwork. There isn't. We had legal counsel. Michael interrupted. You had assumptions. Victor's face lost its color. Evan stared at me. You knew? I met his eyes. I knew the moment you asked for my property records. You tricked me. No. You simply never asked the right questions. Victor turned toward Evan. You told me everything was under your control. Evan stammered. I thought. You thought? Victor's voice echoed across the lobby. You guaranteed this acquisition. I believed. You guaranteed it. Linda quietly stepped away from the desk. Several nurses had gathered nearby. Residents watched from the sitting room. Nobody said a word. The room had become very small for my son. Michael opened another folder. It gets worse. Victor looked up. Michael continued. Mrs. Ellis anticipated the possibility that someone might attempt to remove her decision-making authority. He handed copies to everyone present. 3 months ago, she executed updated legal directives, independent medical evaluations, and notarized competency certifications. Susan nodded. Perfectly valid. Deputy Hawthorne added quietly. Everything checks out. Evan's shoulders dropped. He finally understood. There had never been a shortcut. There had never been a weakness. There had only been patience. Victor whispered. This deal is dead. Michael corrected him. No. The deal never existed. Victor looked at Evan with open disgust. You cost my company 6 months. And you nearly cost your mother everything. Then he simply picked up his briefcase and walked out the front doors. No dramatic exit. No final speech. Just a businessman leaving behind a bad investment. Only now. The bad investment was my son. Stop for 1 second. If your heart is pounding right now, if you've been waiting for this moment since the beginning, hit like. Not for me, but for everyone who was told they were powerless and proved otherwise. And subscribe, because what happened to Evan after everyone left that lobby is a story I've never shared until now. One more thing, leave deeds in the comments. 1 word. That's all. I'll be reading every single one tonight. Evan stood alone. The confidence was gone. So? What happens now? I answered honestly. Now. You go home. And me? I stay. He looked around the lobby. I thought. I know. You really own this place? I always did. He rubbed his forehead. I was trying to help. No. You were trying to inherit early. His eyes filled with tears. Mine didn't. Not because I didn't love him. Because grief and trust are different things. One can survive. The other rarely does. Linda stepped closer. Mrs. Ellis. I'm sorry. You have nothing to apologize for. She lowered her voice. He told us you were becoming confused. I know. I should have called you directly. You will next time. She nodded. I promise. That afternoon, I held a staff meeting in the dining hall. Every employee attended. Housekeepers. Nurses. Maintenance. Kitchen staff. Nearly 60 people. I have only one new policy, I told them. If anyone, family included, tries to speak for one of our residents without proper authority, verify everything. No exceptions. No assumptions. Paperwork before promises. The entire room applauded. Not for me. For the principal. Within 2 weeks, Victor Langford's investment group quietly withdrew from 3 other healthcare acquisitions. After questions arose about their practices, rumors traveled much faster than official statements. Evan resigned from the consulting firm that had introduced him to Victor. Whether he jumped or was pushed no longer mattered. His reputation had become expensive. Natalie mailed me a handwritten letter just before Thanksgiving. It contained no excuses. Only one sentence that stayed with me. I kept hoping he'd remember you were his mother before he remembered your balance sheet. She filed for divorce the following spring. I wasn't surprised. Some betrayals don't end with one victim. 6 months later, on April 18, 2025, there was a knock at my office door. It was my granddaughter, Emma, 19 years old, carrying 2 coffees and a notebook. I want to learn. Learn what? Everything. The business. I smiled. That's a very big word. She laughed. So start with the first lesson. I opened the same old filing cabinet my grandmother had once shown me. The same cabinet. The same careful folders. The same quiet philosophy. I handed Emma a peppermint candy. She looked confused. Why candy? My grandmother always started this way. And what did she teach you? I looked toward the lobby where residents were laughing over a game of cards. Then I answered. The loudest people usually own the least. She wrote it down. And the second lesson? I placed the original deed gently on the desk. The quiet ones keep the paperwork. Today I still live in the apartment on the 3rd floor overlooking the maple tree outside my window. Every October those leaves turn the same brilliant shade of red they wore the morning my son believed he was locking me away. The residents know me simply as Margaret. Some have no idea I own the building. I prefer it that way. Peace is surprisingly inexpensive once you stop trying to convince people who you are. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever carried the weight while someone else expected the reward, share it with one person who needs to hear that dignity doesn't disappear just because someone says it does. Subscribe if you want to hear what happened to Evan 6 months later, because that chapter is even harder to believe. And comment, I did it, if you've ever walked out of a room stronger than the person who tried to trap you. I see you. I see every single one of you. And I'm proud of you. I looked once more at the maple tree outside my window, locked the deed back inside the old filing cabinet, and quietly smiled, because I had kept the paperwork, and, in the end, I had kept my life.